People think that that's how Douglas got their name. And then there's another school of thought that thinks it was named for the Douglas family, who was a very prominent family in Coffee County and who were one of the first families to settle in this area. So actually, the truth is nobody really knows which it was.
Those sound good.
Yeah. Douglas, most people don't know, but Douglas was built on 7 hills, just like Rome was.
Okay, I didn't know that.
My mother said when she was a little girl that there was all this up and down hill you had to walk to get anywhere. And I've heard Chris Trowell as well tell us about the hills that Douglas was built on originally. But I suppose in building the streets and so forth, they filled in and done whatever they needed to do to get it right. Douglas was chosen as the county seat because it was located right in the middle of the county.
Okay.
And so that was the reason it was chosen. There wasn't any special reason. But I want to stop right now and give credit to Chris Trowell, because Chris Trowell is one of the most wonderful historians that we've got. And Chris wrote a wonderful paper called Douglas Before Memory. And when I want to check any information I've got, he was kind enough to give me a copy of that paper. And when I want to check my information, I go to Chris's paper and check it out. And Douglas, we're really lucky to have Chris Trowell and Todd with us. Todd Warnock, because they are both wonderful historians and researchers. Now they know how to research in a way to prove everything that they put down. Now I'm more of a storyteller. I just know the stories from the old people and from the things that I've read and I've heard and so forth. And so I don't always know how to check my information. It may just be a story that I've heard, but it might not really be the truth.
Right. That is amazing. So the streets, when did they get started?
Well, the streets got started being named around 1887. Mr. Benajah Peterson.
Yes.
And a lot of people want to pronounce that differently, but I've always heard it all my life as Mr. Benajah.
Yes, me too.
So that was his name, Mr. Benajah Peterson, who owned most of the downtown Douglas. Now, he didn't own it originally. The Peterson farm was nearby, but as he decided that Douglas was going to be the county seat and probably was going to grow, he began to buy land in the area that he thought was be the downtown. And so then he began selling off lots as people wanted to build a store or to bring some kind of a business to Douglas. He owned the land. They had to see Mr. Peterson to buy a lot.
Smart business.
That's right, and so that's how that started. And the street names have really changed several times. And one street that you could talk about is Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue was originally called Jail Street because the first jail was located sort of in what we now know as the downtown area, but it was on Madison.
Wow.
And it was originally called Jail Street. So that is how Madison got its name. So that's, but I don't know why it was called Madison. Maybe we were just trying to be fancy or something.
Maybe we want to upgrade ourselves.
Yes, right.
Well, Ashley Street, it was once Sycamore, I believe, wasn't it? Or was it?
Yeah, actually it was Sycamore. First I'm going to tell you about Ward Street because
Okay.
it's a pretty easy one to tell you about. Ward Street, everybody seems to be in consensus of opinion that it was named for Calvin Ward, who was our first mayor.
Yes.
And Mr. Ward built a home for he and his wife there on Ward Street, and that's that big old blue house that's catacombed across from the Ameris Bank.
Right.
And that's where Mr. Ward lived, and he was our mayor first mayor in 1896-97.
Okay.
He served as mayor, and Mr. Ward's wife died, and he was just devastated by her death, and so he gave the land for Emma Ward Park down there and asked that it be named Emma Ward Park in memory of his wife. And so that's how the park got its name down there. One of the most interesting streets is probably Peterson Avenue, because Peterson has changed name 3 times.
Three?
3 times.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. The first map shows it in 1890, and it shows the street as being named as Jacksonville Street.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether it was named that because it was in the direction of Jacksonville, Georgia, but the street ended right down there by the Methodist Church. It didn't go any further, because from there on was a big cow pasture that Mr. Dan Gaskins had.
Yes.
And so the street didn't go any further. It ended right there at the Methodist Church. And down that street, right about where what am I trying to say, the bakery.
Oh, Holt's Bakery.
Where the Holt's Bakery is, right about there was a huge oak tree in the middle of the street. And so most of the time you came down that street and rode around the oak tree and then back down town, because that's as far as you could go with that street. And then Peterson, it didn't become Peterson till much later, because it went through another change. It was named Walnut Street. By 1900, there's a map that shows it was named Walnut Street. And I don't know why that was the name, unless it was just because it was maybe walnuts, trees growing down the street or what. And then Mr. Peterson died, and the street eventually, I think, was named in his honor, because they had that house where Sim's funeral home is. That was the Peterson home. He married Vicey Kirkland, and they just had one son, and the son's name was Oliver. And when the son got ready to get married, Mr. and Ms. Peterson built him a beautiful home right there where the bakery is now, where Holt's Bakery is.
I remember that home when it was
yes,
there.
it was beautiful. And if you remember, that home was moved,
right,
and it's down Jackson Street, right near where the GNF Railroad used to run by.
Yeah, right next to the Boys and Girls Club now.
But it was a beautiful home and well kept up. She had a yard man and a maid and a full-time cook. She had 3 full-time helpers all the time. And
the
so,
most beautiful woodwork was in that house.
Oh, that home
the boards in that floor were this wide.
That's right.
I remember that part.
It was kept up, the staircase and everything.
Gorgeous.
Was beautiful. The worst whipping I ever got was for stealing some of the kumquats out of their yard when I was a little girl. She called my mama and told her I had stolen the kumquats, and so I got a real whipping for stealing the kumquats out of her yard. I remember that very well. But that was, Peterson Avenue was probably not named Peterson until probably after, around 1920, after Mr. Peterson died. I think he died in 1915. But I was going to tell you about their son, Oliver. Their son, Oliver, after he was grown and married even, he liked to go around with the crowd that liked to drink and carouse around and so forth.
Social.
Yes, social crowd. And so one night they were fooling around with a gun, and there was an accident with the gun, and he was shot and killed. And that case came to court, but it was ruled an accident because they were all drinking and they all playing around with the gun, and there was no really intent to kill him. It was just an accident. And so that was proved to be an accident, and that's how that went. I really think, from reading it, I think Mr. Dave Tanner was the one who actually fired the gun, but the other members of the group who were there said they were all playing around with it. Nobody really meant to kill anybody. You know, they were just drinking and not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Well, back to Ashley Street. Tell me a little bit about Ashley Street. I got some ideas. But
Well, Ashley Street was originally called Sycamore Street, and I can remember growing up that there was a row of sycamore trees on both sides of that street, all the way down that street. They were beautiful. And so, of course, that was why it was named Sycamore. And then at a later time, after Mr. Ashley died, it was named Ashley Street. Now, that's a really interesting story about the Ashleys. Mr. Ashley was from a very wealthy family. from up around the Muggy River. They had a huge plantation up there along with many other families, had a big cotton plantation with lots of slaves and so forth, and they made lots of money. And eventually, he came to the Douglas area. I don't really know why, but he came there and he married a Miss Ada Clements. And she was about 20 years younger than he was. But he was a handsome man and quite wealthy. So I imagine that had a lot of appeal. Now, I've been told that, you know, the house is now the Welcome Center.
Right.
And it's located, it's on the area where there was a turpentine still. Sellers turpentine still was there at one time. And I've heard that when he built the house, he first built the foundation, and he allowed the foundation to sit there for a solid year before he built anything else on the house, so that it would settle and there would never be any cracks in the house anywhere. And he and Mrs. Slater lived in the hotel while the house was being built. And so eventually, then that street was called Ashley Street.
I've got a confession to make.
All right.
I am in love with Ada Slater. I have been doing some research on her, and we're going to spend a week one time talking about Miss Ada, because she was a woman before her time.
She was a woman before her time.
I just cannot wait for you and I to get together and talk about Miss Ada.
And Miss Ada had 4 sisters who eventually, at one time or another, lived on Gaskin Avenue.
It's just, she's just an amazing woman to me.
She was. She was.
Totally amazing.
She took over her husband's business after he died, and she was something else. And then she married Mr. Slater, who was almost 20 years younger than she was.
I'm telling you, we could talk for 6 months about Miss Ada.
So she was first married to somebody 20 years older, and then married to somebody 20 years younger.
Amazing. You mentioned the Sellers, and there's a Sellers Street. Is there any connection with that family?
Yes, I'm sure the Sellers Street was mentioned for him, but you know, I don't really know his first name.
I never found anything about that.
I know he had a commissary downtown, and I guess it kind of became a grocery store eventually.
Right.
And then he had the turpentine still, and then there were a lot of quarters where the turpentine hands lived on down the street there. And that's about all I know. I never have researched Sellers.
Now, there's a Tanner Street in Douglas, but there were 1,000 Tanners.
Yes. Yes, there were. Tanner Street was originally named for the old sheriff, Mr. Barry Hampton Tanner. He was elected the first sheriff of Coffee County when Coffee County was formed in 1854. And so the street was named for him. Now, when Tanner Street was first named and was first there, it was as long as any of the other streets. But through the years, the buildings needed more room, and so they built backwards and cut Tanner Street off, and that's why it was cut off so short. But it was, at one time, just as long as any of the other streets were. But that's what happened to it.
What about Gaskin Avenue?
Well, nobody knows who Gaskin Avenue was named for. There are a lot of theories, and I have never found anybody who really is convinced of any Gaskin it was named for. But there was a big Gaskin family here, and so I guess it was just named for some of the Gaskins.
There was a book published several years ago, Silk Stocking Row, of course, but Graveyard, was the cemetery always out that way?
Yes, the cemetery was always out that way when they started burying out there. And the road, little dirt road that went from Douglas all down that road out to the cemetery, and it was called Graveyard Road. And then whenever the lots were sold off, the lots were bought and then divided and sold around 1900. And when they were sold off, then all of the swanky people of Coffee County began building houses up and down that street. And then that became known as Silk Stocking Row, because all the wealthy people and the important people that were the movers and shakers of Douglas were living on that street. And so it became known as Silk Stocking Row. And so that's how the book was named, from Graveyard Road to Silk Stocking Road.
My favorite memory of Gaskin Avenue as a child was coming to town with my parents or my grandparents